Hey everybody, so we're in the home stretch here, and by now you probably have a good idea of what you're going to be doing for your final project, what kind of app you're going to be building. And so in this video, I just want to walk you through the process of executing your plan and give you some general tips on how to work out potential bugs in your app. Okay, so let's go ahead and dive in here. So the first thing I want to say is that when you start off, you should work on the data first, right? So figure out what kind of data you need for the app, and then go ahead and start wrangling it. And then I would advise that you don't have to complete all of the data. So some projects, for example, may include multiple data sets, and you might have to merge multiple data sets. But for the purposes of building and testing your app, you may only need a subset of that data. I would work with some manageable amount of data, wrangle an initial data frame that you can work with, and go from there. The second sort of related tip is start off in a separate file. Don't try to do everything in your app.r file. This is the code for the app that we did, the scatterplot app that we did, where we had an x and a y axis, and then users can choose which variables they wanted on the x and the y axis from the short list of variables, and then it generated a scatter plot. So what I did when I was prepping that app was I went ahead and I wrangled the data in a separate file. Okay, and similarly, you could do a similar thing with the visualization that you want to build, and just make sure that the code for the visualization works. Like if you have a ggplot object that you're going to create as output, or a table that you're going to create as output, or if you want to run a regression, just test it out in a separate app. Don't try to do it all in one go in your app.r file, because it'll be harder to figure out what is going wrong if something's going wrong. Another thing I would suggest is, rather than starting out with all the code, maybe just starting with a general skeleton of the code. Okay, so for example, one thing you can do is you could just, and I'm just going to go ahead and delete a bunch of stuff here, so you could see like a basic starting point for how to build your app. But one thing you might want to do is just kind of say, okay, what are the function calls that I'm going to need to make this app work before I even stick any variables in here. And I'm not suggesting that you go through and after you build the app, go ahead and delete stuff. But rather than trying to get all the function calls and all the arguments right, just start off with the basic, this basic shell of an app with the function calls to see what that is going to look like, and to make sure that you have all of the parentheses and all of the brackets in the right place before you go ahead and add all the arguments. So if we look at this code here, we know we're going to load the packages, we're going to load the data. Maybe we don't have our data in final form yet, we only have some of the data, but that's the next thing we're going to do. Then we know we're going to create a list of name values for the input selection. Then we're going to define the UI. We're going to call fluid page, and then within that, title panel, and then within that we're going to have a sidebar panel, sidebar layout with a sidebar panel, and we're going to have two inputs in that panel, right? Two drop-down menus. And then we're going to have a main panel, so we'll have a sidebar and a main panel within our UI. And then within the server, our output is going to be a scatter plot, right? And then we're going to build the code for the scatter plot here, okay? So in other words, start with your comments and your function calls as a way of building the scaffolding of your app, rather than trying to do everything all at once. So I'm going to go ahead and put everything back here. Okay. So that's the next tip. Another one is that you can test your, we haven't done this before, but you can go ahead and test your UI absent your server function being completed. So I just want to show you that that's possible. So if we go here and we just take our render plot, we take our output and we can comment it out with a Control-Shift-C or Command-Shift-C on a Mac. So if we do that and we just run the code like this, then what it's going to do is it's going to show us the UI. So we can play around with the UI and just make sure that the various elements of the UI are in place before we go ahead and build the server. Okay, so you can test your UI separate from your server code, even if your server code isn't ready to go. You do have to call the server function in order for it to work. Otherwise you'll get an error, but if it's empty, it's not a big deal. Next thing I want to kind of emphasize here is that you want to make sure that you're calling the input appropriately. So one thing I see students doing is that they aren't necessarily paying attention to, like in their ggplot call, they're not referring properly to the user input or referring to the user input at all. Remember, this is a reactive, dynamic relationship between the server and the UI. So if you're calling input from the UI, then you have to note that with input $, and then whatever the name of the input is. So don't forget that step. Another thing that I want to emphasize while we're in this code chunk here is the idea of non-standard evaluation. Remember that ggplot is set up so that you can put the raw column name as your argument for the X and the Y variables, right? So if you're getting user input that's just raw text, then you have to convert that by using get, and there are a couple of other functions, but the one that I've taught you in this course or emphasized in this course is get. Get will translate that text input into the raw column name so that ggplot will, recognize it as a column name. Okay, for the last two things that I want to cover here, I'm going to switch over to the Fred line chart app that we built. There's two things basically that I want to emphasize here. One is, remember that when you're dealing with a reactive function in your server function in the context of your server code, so when we are reactively updating our data, when we call that data frame subsequently, we have to remember to put it in parentheses, the name of it in parentheses. So here we're creating this data frame called Fred indicator with a reactive function, and later we're calling it to filter it down here, and we're referring to it with parentheses. And again, this is to make sure that the reactive function is activated and that you're calling the most recent data. Similarly, when we're down here in the ggplot call and we're creating our ggplot object, when we're referring to the Fred data up here, we're again using the parentheses because these are data that are created with a reactive function. Okay. Then the last thing I want to emphasize here is you'll see I've added this line of code here, print Fred data n equals 100. So let me go ahead and comment out the ggplot here, the ggplot code. And what I want to show you is essentially if you put print inside of your reactive output here, then what it will do is it will show you these data in the console, right? It will show you what's in this data frame in the console, right? So let me just show you what I mean here. So if we go ahead and rerun the app, okay, and see now it's printed the first 100 rows of the data that are in there. All right, now if we go back and we change something like business confidence, then it's going to print the first 100 rows for the business confidence indicator. Let me just scroll down here so it's easier to see. And now it's printed the composite indicator, unemployment rate, okay? And we can also change the dates, right? So it's going to print different dates for us, right? And this is a way, like if you want to see what is going on in your reactive function, right? Because otherwise there's no way to, like if for some reason your plot output isn't working, and you can't figure out if the error is here in the server function or if it's up somewhere in the UI, you may want to just print the data out to see exactly what's going on, right? So that can be a nice troubleshooting tool. All right, you can also do, just like print, you could do glimpse instead of print, and so we could do glimpse Fred data. All right, and we'll just comment out print, and let's go ahead and we'll just go ahead and rerun the app and see. So now it's telling us, it's executing the glimpse function, right? And it's telling us, you know, what the variables are and the first few observations in each column. So the last thing I want to remind you of is just to think about what each piece of your code is supposed to be doing and whether it's accomplishing what you wanted it to accomplish. What is this code doing to my data? What did I expect it to do to my data? And is it doing what I thought it was going to do, right? So it's good to experiment every once in a while to try different things out when you're troubleshooting, but don't do that indefinitely. Come up with a plan and try to think through what it is you're trying to accomplish with your code. So that's all the tips I have for building your Shiny app. In the next module, the last module, we're going to talk about how to publish your Shiny apps, how to share them with other people, and also how to share your code. Okay, I'll see you in the next lesson.